What happens when Hollywood's most iconic hard-edged star steps into a studio filled with daytime television personalities who believe they can steer the conversation wherever they want? The result is a moment no one in the room anticipated. Clint Eastwood, the man whose screen presence was built on quiet authority and unflinching resolve, arrived for what was supposed to be an ordinary promotional visit. Instead, he found himself locked in a tense exchange with Joy Behar, turning a calm interview into something far more combustible. The cameras were rolling live as Whoopi Goldberg welcomed the guest with her usual warmth. She introduced Eastwood to a cheering audience, praising his legendary career as applause echoed through the studio. Eastwood acknowledged the crowd with a brief nod before settling into his seat, his posture relaxed, his hands resting evenly on the armrests. He thanked the hosts in his gravelly, unmistakable voice, setting a composed and respectful tone. The discussion began smoothly. Whoopi guided the conversation toward his latest film, inviting him to talk about what drew him to the project. Eastwood spoke thoughtfully about themes of redemption and second chances, explaining that he was drawn to stories where flawed individuals are allowed the possibility of growth. He noted that society often writes people off too quickly, forgetting that human beings are capable of change. Sarah Haynes leaned in, clearly engaged by his words, and praised the depth of the message. She asked how he chose projects at this point in his long career, and Eastwood answered with characteristic simplicity. He said he looked for honesty, for stories that reflected something genuine about life rather than escapism. Hollywood, he added, already had more fantasy than it needed. For several minutes the exchange flowed easily. Eastwood shared insights about directing, working with actors, and trusting instincts developed over decades in the industry. The audience listened attentively, drawn in by his calm delivery and understated wisdom. Everything about the segment felt measured and professional. Throughout this, Joy Behar remained unusually quiet, leaning back with a faint smile that suggested patience rather than disinterest. She waited, watching for the right opening. When she finally spoke, the shift in tone was immediate. She addressed Eastwood directly, noting his emphasis on truth and redemption before pivoting sharply to his past political remarks. She implied that some of his public positions seemed at odds with the values he was describing. The mood in the studio changed instantly. Whoopi cast a quick, cautionary glance in Joy's direction, sensing the tension rising. Eastwood turned his attention fully toward Joy, his expression tightening just enough to signal that the conversation had entered different territory. He asked calmly which remark she was referring to, his voice steady but firm. Joy responded with a light, almost playful tone that contrasted with the weight of her accusation. She referenced his support for certain political figures known for controversial rhetoric, suggesting that even indirect association carried meaning. Eastwood replied evenly that he had never made statements demeaning women or minorities, his words precise and controlled. Joy pushed further, arguing that endorsements themselves send messages. Around the table, the other hosts shifted uncomfortably, aware that the interview had veered off course. Eastwood leaned back slightly and fixed Joy with a look honed by decades of screen performances. He stated that he had worked with people from every background and belief system long before most current commentators entered the public sphere. He judged individuals by their character, he said, not by party labels. Joy bristled at his phrasing, objecting to his tone and asserting her right to challenge guests. Eastwood did not raise his voice. He countered that he also had the right to decline what he described as questions designed more to provoke than to understand. His composure remained intact, but the edge in his words was unmistakable. Joy accused him of dismissing legitimate journalism, insisting she was merely addressing his public record. Eastwood answered with a brief, humorless chuckle, remarking that journalism once relied on facts and preparation rather than baiting tactics. The comment landed sharply, drawing a collective intake of breath from the room. Whoopi attempted to redirect the discussion back to the film, hoping to defuse the situation. Joy refused to let go, insisting that public figures should expect scrutiny. She brought up his infamous empty chair moment from a past political convention, framing it as evidence of erratic behavior. Eastwood acknowledged the incident without hesitation, describing it as a creative metaphor meant to highlight accountability. When Joy labeled it unhinged, the studio fell completely silent. Eastwood leaned forward, lowering his voice to a near whisper, the kind that commanded attention without effort. He reminded her of his lifetime of work and experience, implying that perspective mattered. The tension was palpable as every eye remained fixed on the exchange, aware that the balance of power in the room had subtly but decisively shifted. He calmly asked how many films she had directed, produced, or even acted in, and before she could fully respond, he followed by mentioning awards and recognition earned through decades of work. Joy Behar dismissed those points as irrelevant, her voice rising as she insisted that her role as a television host and comedian placed her on equal footing in the conversation. Her tone suggested confidence, but the strain beneath it was becoming obvious to everyone watching. He continued without raising his voice, shifting the focus from trophies to impact. He spoke about building careers, offering opportunities to newcomers, and telling stories that stayed with audiences long after the screen went dark. He contrasted that with what he saw happening at the table. Joy pushed back, saying she entertained millions every day, yet the certainty she had displayed earlier was clearly slipping. From his seat, he observed that what looked like entertainment to her often resembled orchestrated ambushes designed to spark outrage rather than understanding. Sarah Haynes attempted to soften the atmosphere, redirecting attention toward his achievements and asking about fulfillment in his career. He acknowledged her effort but made it clear he was not finished addressing the tension. He said the most meaningful part of his work had been collaborating with professionals who understood that respect was mutual, not something demanded through volume or provocation. He added pointedly that he valued conversations that did not rely on a group setting to take cheap shots at a single guest. Joy reacted with visible shock, protesting that her questions were valid and rooted in public accountability. He countered that what she was really chasing was a viral moment, something that could be clipped and shared rather than a genuine exchange of ideas. There was a clear difference, he explained, between asking about beliefs and engineering confrontation for attention. Joy denied the accusation, insisting she was simply doing her job. He replied evenly that her job was to engage guests on the reason they were invited, not to turn the segment into a spectacle. Whoopi Goldberg again tried to pull the discussion back to the film, mentioning how compelling the premise sounded. He finally spoke about the story, describing a man burdened by past mistakes who was trying to improve himself. As he spoke, his gaze never left Joy. He remarked that sometimes the greatest barriers to growth were not circumstances, but people who refused to allow others to move beyond who they once were. The parallel was impossible to miss. Sarah praised the theme, emphasizing how powerful redemption was in storytelling. Joy, however, seized on the word, arguing that some individuals were undeserving of second chances, especially those aligned with divisive politics. His jaw tightened slightly. He asked whether she was referring to the fictional character or once again making the conversation personal. She claimed she was talking about accountability and responsibility, particularly for public figures with influence. His response was quiet but carried unmistakable weight. He questioned what responsibility television hosts owed to their guests. Joy fired back that it was their duty to ask difficult questions. He disagreed, stating that basic human decency should come first, something he felt had been abandoned. Around the table, the other hosts exchanged anxious looks as producers gestured frantically off camera. Joy laughed sharply and accused him of hypocrisy, pointing to his long history of portraying violent characters and celebrating gun culture. An audible gasp rippled through the audience, as even seasoned viewers sensed a line had been crossed. He leaned back and studied her carefully, as if reassessing her entirely. When he spoke again, his tone was measured, not angry. He told her that her mistake was believing volume equaled correctness and confrontation equaled courage. In his view, it only revealed someone using a microphone as a shield to bully others. Joy erupted, her voice reaching a pitch that made the room tense. He remained steady, explaining that taking shots at guests who were constrained by politeness did not make someone powerful, only smaller. She stood abruptly, face flushed with anger, listing her years of experience and the high-profile figures she had interviewed. He replied by asking how many of those people left feeling respected and how many believed they had participated in a professional conversation. Joy stumbled over her words, declaring she did not need to tolerate such treatment. He agreed, adding that he also did not need to remain seated while his work and intentions were twisted into a personal stage show. Whoopi finally spoke firmly, urging everyone to pause. He stood slowly, saying that the situation was already clear. Joy accused him of walking away because he could not handle scrutiny. With a familiar, unwavering look, he said he had come out of courtesy to discuss something meaningful, not to serve as a target. She protested that the show was live and he could not simply leave. He replied that real power was knowing when to walk away rather than trapping someone on television. Joy tried one last time to frame his exit as weakness. He turned toward the main camera and addressed viewers directly, stating that he had intended to talk about art and storytelling, but instead encountered a setup aimed at generating outrage. That, he said, revealed far more about modern television than it did about him. He then turned back toward Joy, his expression calm, and the silence in the studio felt heavier than any argument that had come before. He said that dealing with hard questions was nothing new to him, adding that he had been doing so long before she ever held a microphone. The distinction, he explained, was that those questions were usually posed by people who understood professionalism. Joy Behar's face flushed a deep shade of red as anger overtook her composure. She accused him of arrogance and implied that he believed he could demean her on her own program. The accusation lingered in the air, heavy and sharp. The studio fell into absolute silence. The audience did not stir, the panel looked stunned, and even the crew appeared frozen. Clint Eastwood slowly turned back toward Joy Behar. For a brief moment, his expression mirrored the characters he had portrayed for decades, calm, unflinching, and unmistakably finished with the exchange. He repeated her insult quietly, as if weighing it. The word sounded different when spoken back, stripped of its sting and turned into something reflective. He remarked that it was a curious criticism coming from someone whose public identity was largely built around sitting at a table discussing the achievements of others. The silence that followed felt overwhelming. Every person in the room absorbed the remark, fully aware that something irreversible had just been said. Eastwood remained composed, yet the atmosphere around him felt charged. He repeated the insult again, slowly this time, explaining that throughout his career he had been called many things, but those labels usually came from people who had created something lasting themselves. Joy appeared to realize she had crossed a line, but pride kept her from retreating. She insisted that she had achieved more than enough to deserve respect. His response came in that low, controlled tone that carried more weight than raised voices ever could. He spoke about what achievement really meant, listing the countless moments where interviews had turned into confrontations, where guests had been belittled instead of engaged, and where meaningful discussions had been derailed in favor of spectacle. Joy attempted to defend herself, claiming she asked necessary questions, though her voice trembled. He corrected her calmly, stating that attention-seeking questions were not the same as meaningful inquiry. He drew a clear line between journalism and performance, noting that one aimed to inform while the other aimed to provoke. In his view, she had lost sight of which role she was meant to play. Whoopi Goldberg made one last attempt to rescue the situation. She suggested starting over and encouraged Joy to apologize so the conversation could return to the film. Joy turned sharply toward Whoopi, refusing outright and defending her actions as part of her job. Eastwood interjected, stating that the responsibility of that job was to entertain and inform, not to treat guests as targets. Joy weakly denied attacking him. He laughed then, but there was no humor in it. He spoke about having experienced real combat in his life, explaining that he knew exactly what an attack looked like. The difference, he said, was that those who confronted him directly in the past did so face to face, not while hiding behind the structure of a television show. The other hosts now openly avoided Joy's gaze. Sarah Haynes looked visibly uncomfortable, as though wishing she could disappear. The audience shifted uneasily, the collective tension impossible to ignore. Joy accused him of posturing and reminded him that the show was her domain, governed by her rules. She declared that if he disliked her approach, he was free to leave. Eastwood responded with a smile so cold it unsettled everyone watching. He acknowledged her statement, agreeing that it was indeed her space, and then added that this was precisely the issue. He rose to his full height, standing above the seated panel, his presence commanding without effort. He described the environment she had created, one where guests were ambushed rather than welcomed, where disagreement was treated as disrespect, and where manufactured drama took precedence over understanding. He congratulated her on building such a place, his words measured and deliberate. Each sentence landed with clarity, leaving no room for misinterpretation. Joy struggled to respond, her anger bubbling over into frustration. The studio remained locked in silence, the moment stretching as everyone sensed the confrontation had reached its peak. Eastwood stood there, composed and resolute, having said exactly what he intended, while the room absorbed the weight of his words. She snapped that if he thought he could simply stroll in and lecture her about television, he was badly mistaken. His response was measured and unhurried. He said he was not lecturing her about television at all, only pointing out that what she was doing barely qualified as television. He described it as a spectacle, adding that she seemed to be running it like the lead performer in a circus. The audience reacted audibly, gasps rippling through the studio in a way rarely heard during daytime broadcasts. Even by generous standards, the moment felt shocking. Joy Behar erupted, her composure completely gone. She shouted that he had no right to come onto her show and insult her in front of a national audience. He calmly repeated her words back to her, emphasizing the phrase, "your show," and glanced around at the rest of the panel. He remarked that the program had always been presented as a shared platform, not a one-person stage built around a single ego, with the others reduced to little more than background voices. At that point, Whoopi Goldberg finally stepped in with authority, telling him to stop and instructing Joy to settle down. Joy ignored the intervention entirely, accusing him of arrogance and moral superiority, claiming he believed himself above everyone else in the room. He answered quietly, saying that the only person displaying disrespect from the start had been her. He noted that she seemed determined to provoke a clash rather than engage in an honest exchange. Joy repeated her familiar defense, insisting she had merely been doing her job, though the words now sounded fragile and unconvincing. He slowly shook his head and explained what that job should have looked like. He said it should have involved discussion of his work, his creative approach, or even thoughtful commentary related to filmmaking. It should have left viewers feeling informed or genuinely entertained. Instead, he said, she had devoted most of the segment to humiliating a guest who had arrived with good intentions, managing only to damage her own credibility and the show's reputation in the process. Joy searched the room for validation, but none appeared. The other hosts avoided her eyes, the audience's reaction was unmistakably against her, and even the crew looked uncomfortable. She eventually snapped that if he refused to answer what she considered real questions, perhaps he should stop agreeing to interviews altogether. He had already begun unclipping his microphone, but he paused when she said that. He turned toward the main camera and explained what meaningful questions actually sounded like. He spoke about curiosity, about asking what motivates someone to keep creating, about lessons learned and stories worth sharing. He added that those kinds of questions required genuine interest in the answers, something clearly missing from the exchange. The studio was silent to the point where even the mechanical hum of equipment felt loud. Joy looked as though she wanted to respond but found herself unable to form words. He continued, his tone softening slightly, saying the real disappointment was the missed opportunity. She had been given the chance to hold a thoughtful conversation with someone who had lived through and contributed to decades of cinematic history. Instead, she chose cheap tactics more commonly associated with online outrage culture than serious broadcasting. He finished removing the microphone and placed it neatly on the table. He said the spectacle had wasted not only his time, but the audience's time as well, and that viewers deserved more than a performance driven by hostility. Joy finally shouted again, accusing him of having no authority to decide what her audience wanted and claiming she had connected with viewers for years. He adjusted his jacket and replied that constant noise was not the same as connection, and that yelling at people should never be confused with meaningful engagement. Behind the cameras, producers waved frantically, unsure how to contain the chaos unfolding live on air. The reality had sunk in that a major guest was walking out after dismantling one of the hosts in full view of millions. Joy called out for security in a last attempt to regain control. He laughed, genuinely this time, and dismissed the idea, saying there was nothing security could do except perhaps protect feelings that had already been bruised. He took one last look around the studio, observing the stunned expressions on every face. He spoke about his long career, about decades spent working alongside exceptional professionals who understood respect and craft. He said that in all those years, he had never encountered a situation quite like this one. Joy tried to twist that remark into sarcasm, but it failed to land. He replied that the interpretation was hers to make, adding that when people discussed the interview afterward, they would not be praising her toughness or integrity. They would be talking about how completely she had lost control on live television. He then walked calmly toward the exit, leaving behind a panel frozen in disbelief, an audience still processing what they had seen, and a host sitting in visible humiliation. As the doors closed, the cameras captured the aftermath. Joy flushed with anger and embarrassment, the others silent and stunned, all aware that something unforgettable had just occurred, though not in the way anyone involved would have wanted.